Hello, this is Module 5.6.4, Phylum Nematoda. This includes the unsegmented roundworms or the nematodes. When you look at this slide, you can see why they are called nematodes. The word nematoda comes from roots which mean thread-like. And you can see, especially here, how thread-like these worms look. Some of the others look larger, especially when greatly magnified, but when you look at them, they're fairly long, thin, and tapered. So let's look at some of the features of the nematodes. The common name of this group, these are the unsegmented roundworms, or simply they're called the nematodes. Most often people call them nematodes. Sometimes in biology class we'll call them unsegmented roundworms to help students to learn their features. Of course, these are unsegmented worms, and so that's a key feature, is that they are worms that have no segments. This is the first group of invertebrate animals that we've studied that have a tube-in-a-tube body plan. That is, they have a complete digestive tract with the mouth on one end and the anus on the other end. They have 3 tissue layers. This is the second group that we've seen this in, and all of the other animals will in fact have 3 tissue layers. The platyhelminths, the flatworms, had 3 tissue layers: ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. Now, Phylum Nematoda is also the first group that we've studied that has a false body cavity, that has a body cavity of any sort. In addition, I note that they have longitudinal muscles only. Some worms, like earthworms, which are segmented worms in a different phylum that we'll learn later, they have fine graded movement. They can move with fair amount of precision and control. The nematodes, because they only have longitudinal muscles, they tend to thrash about a good deal. And so having only longitudinal muscles and not also having a circular layer of muscles means that they tend to move in an erratic, thrashing way. And so if in the future you're a science teacher and you look at pond water and you see a little worm thrashing back and forth, it may likely be a nematode. The skeleton of nematodes consists of their body wall and the fluid pressure within, and we call this a hydrostatic skeleton, or it has hydrostatic fluid pressure in the body cavity to provide support for the body. Now, as far as feeding goes, the nematodes are a very large group with large numbers of individuals. They may be parasitic or they may be free-living. But just to illustrate how numerous they are, when the worm people come from the worm planet and use their worm laser gun that disintegrates everything except worms, and the earth is disintegrated, you would be able to still see where it was by the outline of nematodes. They are so numerous in the soil and in water, bodies of water down in the soil as well. They're not as numerous in the dry soils of deserts, but in moister soils they are extremely numerous. And for those of you that are concerned, I want to tell you that there are no worm people and no worm planet and no worm laser, so we're not going to have the earth disintegrated. But it's just a little thought experiment to consider how very numerous these animals are. The symmetry of these animals, they have bilateral symmetry. Their life cycles are variable. It can be direct in the free-living forms, which a male and a female have sex. The female lays eggs, which hatch into little worms, which grow into larger nematodes that become sexually mature. In parasites, we can have some indirect life cycles, but some of them are direct as well. They just occur inside a host. Here is a genus that I would like you to know. It is a genus name. You can tell because it's capitalized. It's italicized. If you're writing it, you should underline it. It's pronounced Ascaris. So Ascaris is a large intestinal parasite in vertebrate animals. It does afflict humans, and so it's a special note here. I would point out to you that Ascaris pretty much sees you as I'm going to draw here. And you might go, wow, it sees me as a rainbow. No, that's not a rainbow. That's your mouth. And that's your anus. So they see you as a digestive tract. Now, the life cycle of Ascaris is pretty direct, and you should draw it somewhere. And what has to happen is you have to eat the eggs. Now, the eggs are in soil. They were deposited there in feces. Now, the feces can break down and the eggs can still be infective in moist, shaded spots. But in dry spots, the eggs don't live as long in the soil. And so we have much higher incidence of Ascaris infection in the southeast United States, where it's cooler and moister and more shaded, than in the southwest United States, where this is a very rare infection. So they have to eat the egg, and a human has to eat the eggs. And once you eat the eggs, they will hatch in the stomach. They hatch in the stomach, and then the larva will burrow into a blood vessel. So I'm going to say burrow, I'll put here larva, burrows into a blood vessel. And of course the intestines are lined with blood vessels. They're organs of absorption, and so they absorb nutrients. And so once this larva, which is just a couple millimeters long, it's not really large like this 10 or 12-inch worm or anything like that. It's tiny, and it goes on a tour of the body. And so I'm going to write here a tour, and it can go anywhere that blood goes. But where it really wants to go is it wants to end up in the lungs. They can go to the heart or the brain or wherever. And some of the little larvae become lodged in wrong places, but they want to end up in organs that look like this. That's the trachea, these are the bronchi, these are the lungs. And the lungs are highly vascularized. And so the little larva will go in there and it will crawl up the bronchus and up the trachea. Now, if you know about your own anatomy, you know that you do have two tubes. The one in the front is the trachea with the cartilage rings. Behind it is the esophagus through which you eat or drink. You may have choked before and said, oh, it went down the wrong pipe. And that's literally true. But this little worm crawls up to the back of your throat, an area called the pharynx, where both food and air pass. And then have you ever had a little bit of phlegm in your throat and you go, and then you swallow, gulp? Well, that's how the worm gets from the trachea back into the digestive system. Once it's back in the digestive system, it's back here, it will go back into the intestine, where males and females copulate and produce eggs. And the female can produce 200,000 eggs per day. That's a lot of eggs. And so, of course, they grow up to be that large and once they're back in the intestine. And that's basically the life cycle of Ascaris. I did see once a television documentary that showed an island in Africa in which there was high infection of Ascaris. They didn't have good sanitary conditions, so the feces were in the soil, and it showed the children before this. I have some health group, maybe from the United Nations, that came in and dewormed the children, and the children were dull-eyed and listless. And then they dewormed them, and they became bright and lively and vibrant. And they actually paid the kids to bring in the worms so they could get a count. They had to recover them from their own feces, the worms. It's kind of an interesting thing, I suppose. Another example of a parasitic nematode is Trichinella. Trichinella is also a genus. It causes a condition called trichinosis, and it can result from poorly cooked pork. In this case, the little larva worms are encysted in the muscles of the host, and they, if you eat that muscle, that meat, and it's not well cooked to a temperature to kill these guys, they can be infective. And 160 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature, the coolest temperature of any of the pork that you cook. It should be, so you should use a meat thermometer. You should also say thank you very much to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, a government agency which provides regulation and oversight for the production of meat. This has greatly reduced our incidence of this in this country. And so the government does do important work and to help assure your safety. But it's undermined all the time by lack of funding and people who want to deregulate stuff. The third and final parasitic nematode that we're going to talk about, you just simply have to know it as the pinworm. Pinworms are the nematode that most people are most probably infected with. About 1 in 6 adults probably have pinworms. And these worms are tiny little worms, and they live near the rectum, where they will consume feces and things like that. When the host is quiescent, they'll come out and on the rectum, and I don't know what they do. Look around, I suppose, breathe some oxygen. The picture you see on the lower right is a picture of someone having a colonoscopy, and there's that little white worm there. When you have a colonoscopy, they blow your colon or large intestine up full of air, and so you can just see that little worm. It's kind of interesting view there. But many of you are potential parents, and so you need to be aware of some of the zoological hazards, I guess we can call them, that you face as potential future parents. Your kids could get pinworms. Now, pinworms are very infective. The infection rate is much higher among children, and I've heard it stated being as high as 60%, but that's probably in select circumstances, select scenarios that it's that high. But nevertheless, these worms are highly infective. And so if you're a parent, I'm going to teach you one method that you can use. One method is called the 3M method. Now, 3M is a multinational corporation, and one of its products is Scotch tape. And so what you have to do is when your child is sleeping, take some Scotch tape, tear off a piece, and put it sticky side out on your index finger. Spread your child's cheeks and press it in there, trying to collect either eggs or worms. Any technician, laboratory technician, should be able to identify pinworm eggs at a medical facility. And so you can take the tape and tape it onto itself after you've sampled, or you can tape it on a glass microscope slide if you have one. But either way, the technician should be able to use a microscope and search and see if there are evident eggs or even adult worms. Now, if your child wakes up when you're doing this, well, I think it's best if you talk to your child ahead of time and tell them that you're going to look for worms in their butt. Now, this will either horrify them or it will fascinate them. But in any case, it's one of the things that parents have to do. It's a dirty job, but someone has to do it. When a member of the family is infected with pinworms, they're so infectious that you have to treat the entire family. They are so infectious that a child's flatulence can launch eggs into the air, and of course if you breathe that air you could become infected. I listed here a second method, the Ever Ready method, and that's just using a flashlight to look for worms around the anus when they come out of the rectum when the host is quiescent. Another kind of similar thing there. This actually is from the CDC. It shows the pinworms, and what's real diagnostic is the eggs. And in any case, so you should be prepared for pinworms and other zoological challenges as a parent. And with that, we will close this module.